Before on the computer. Okay. Yep. Everyone consent to that. Okay, so if there's no question for those who just came in, I was just saying that the lab group A and B will both be due the following Sunday. So you guys have about 2 weeks to work on that. Oh shoot, I haven't put up the quiz yet. I'm sorry. This whole online thing's throwing me off. I'll get that quiz up. I'll make it. I'll extend it a day. Let me put a note about that. I'll make it due this Sunday instead of on Saturday. I'm sorry about that, guys. Sunday. I'll get that up after a lecture. Okay, sorry about that. Totally slipped my mind. I did get the recording uploaded from last time, and I'll do the same with this one. It just might take a bit because my internet's not that fast. Okay. Any questions so far with class logistic stuff? Oh, I'll see. Still no known time for the campus to open. I'm really hoping they just stick to the 2-week thing. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I'm just gonna jump right into things where we left off last time. Okay. Cool. Okay, so let's jump back into it, talking about development of the theory of evolution. As I was saying, well, let's go back to that first slide, introducing evolution. So evolution is the change over time and characteristics of a population. So evolution does not happen on the individual. So population meaning all individuals of the species in an area, versus so what occurs on the individual to cause evolution is selection, and what we're going to focus on today is natural selection. So I want to get into the history behind the development of evolution. So it's not something that Darwin didn't come up with the theory of evolution. We'll get on to what he came up with, but ideas of evolution came way before, thousands of years before. I show this here with like Greek, Roman philosophers, which they believed in things like essentialism, like everything's striving to be its perfect form. So a little more abstract concepts, and I want to get this in here about the fact that everything's very Western centric, but there were thinkers in the East who had similar ideas of essentialism and transmutation of things kind of striving to be better. So in a more, I don't know, I guess personifying life in a way. But there's not that much info on them, unfortunately. So we'll focus mostly on the European dudes. Let me double check. Anyone trying to get in? I really hope this will notify me while I'm on screen share. So starting with English naturalist John Ray, this is in the 1600s, 1700s. He was an early taxonomist. So taxonomists are people who they basically try to name things and group things. So modern taxonomy, that's your Homo sapien, our genus and species, and down the list like that. So he's an early taxonomist. He was focusing on plants, grouping them based on their similarities and differences, and he came up with the idea of species, the species concept, which we'll get into in a later lecture. That's a fun topic. So you'll notice a lot of these early biology thinkers, these people coming up with this theory of evolution, they were a lot of them were taxonomists. Then you have Buffon. He has a big long French name, but I'll just call him Buffon. He believed, as many did, that all life was created at once, but where his ideas were a little more radical was that he did believe in this gradual change, or a change could be an improvement, or in his view, degeneration into a more basal form. over time, due to environmental factors or random chance, I forgot to fix that, not random chance, random chance, that life could change. So that alone was pretty radical thinking, because at the time it was believed that all things were made by a creator as they are and as they always would be. Things did not change. Then we get into a contemporary of hers, or of his, which is a Swedish taxonomist, physician Linnaeus. That's where we get the Linnaean taxonomy system. He came up with, well, he kind of built onto an existing classification system, but it became known as the Linnaean system. And in his day, that was kingdom, class, order, genus, species. So species, so building on larger categories on top of Ray's species concept. And now this is moved into what we now have, the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So we still use Linnaean taxonomy. And I have issues with Linnaean taxonomy. I have issues with Linnaeus in general. He was kind of a jerk. I think I mentioned last time, he would name people that he didn't like. He would name bad things, creatures, weeds, and things like that, worms and things he would name after people he didn't like. Very passive aggressive. And he believed that all life was created as is and didn't change. So it's immutability. So he butted heads with Buffon, which is a contemporary of his. They're born the same year. I just noticed that. So there was this debate at the time: as things do change, things change, do things not change? So this classification system he came up with, which we'll learn more about in later lectures, I have issues with, because it was made by someone who didn't believe in change and evolution. So therefore, the system only describes things as is, and the Linnaean taxonomic system isn't not adaptive to new species evolving. So because it was made by a guy who didn't believe in evolution, so it's hard to add in new species that come about. That's why we have things like subspecies, and because we're kind of bound to this system. It's kind of an abstract thing. We'll get more into that later. But this is the guy, still uses the system today, didn't believe in evolution. Kind of wacky, but that's how it is. Then we have Darwin's, yes, I am recording the lecture. Yeah, so I'll upload it later. I got the first one uploaded. Apologies, I didn't start uploading till halfway through. My charger closer. Till halfway through. So the last one we only got half, but this one I just started at the beginning. So I'll upload it if you have issues streaming it. So yeah, so Darwin, so he wasn't original in coming up with evolution. Again, he didn't come up with theory of evolution. Neither was he the only Darwin to be in this. And Erasmus Darwin, oh, there's another typo, man. I got a lot of typos. He's not still alive, and alive until 1100, 802. That should be 1802. Passed away in 1802. So he was Charles Darwin's grandfather. He wrote of concepts of evolution in some of his medical works. This quote here: "The strongest and most active animal should propagate species, which should then become improved." So he's kind of believing that the strongest reproduce, and therefore its offspring are strong, and so on and so forth. So it's a very unrefined mechanism for evolution he came up with, but it's important to point out because it did influence Darwin later on. He was, I think, more like his grandfather than he was his father. His father was very didn't agree with his adventuring ways. Yeah, Erasmus Darwin, interesting dude, bit of a philanderer, also a poet, wrote about some nice biology poems, which I feel is a very underutilized poetry genre, biology poetry. So I believe this is where we got to on Tuesday. So I'm kind of paranoid. Is anyone trying to get in? There we go. I can look it on my phone. Okay. Yeah. So a big So a lot of people like Linnaeus thought things were immutable, that they didn't change. Everything was created as is and would never change. A lot of those people, I believe Linnaeus included, also didn't believe in extinction. The basic idea was that God wouldn't allow any of his creations to go extinct, to die out. So extinction there, that's termination of a taxon. So one of those groupings, generally species goes extinct, like the dodo or what have you. Until along came this French naturalist and paleontologist, Georges Cuvier, and he pushed this extinction theory into the mainstream using fossil evidence. So he oh good, it does pop up. There we go. Still learning about Zoom's interface. He pushed this in the mainstream by he basically showed there's a mastodon skeleton there. He showed that there were a lot of mastodon skeletons around Paris, and his basic reasoning was like, "Hey guys, do you see any mastodons today?" And everyone's like, "No," and he's like, "I rest my case." And so that's how I'm really oversimplifying that, but essentially how he got that into mainstream acceptance. He still denied evolution. He believed everything was made and things didn't change, but things gradually went extinct. So this cataclysmum theory. That's a hard word to say. That basically things are being reduced over time by huge catastrophic events like floods or volcanoes, that sort of thing. Flood was a popular thing because people still were going off of like Noah's flooding and that sort of thing, influencing biodiversity as we see it today. So he believes things didn't change, but that they would gradually be reduced through extinction events. But useful in that he mainstreamed the belief in extinction. Another big change in thinking was the recognition that Earth is really, really old and shaped by physical forces. So again, a lot of these, and it's very framed European, a lot of these European thinkers were Christians. So they stuck to some a lot of the kind of evangelically pushed explanations for the Earth. So that's things like God wouldn't let things go extinct, or that the Earth was a few thousand years old, that sort of thing. So breaking out of that mold a bit was realizing how much older the Earth was. So here enters British geologist William Smith, and he came up with this principle of faunal succession, basically just looking at layers in rocks and showing that there are different fossils in each layer, so distinct fossil layers, but also those layers, if you went to a different place, you'd find similar fossils in the same layer. So across the world, the same event was happening. So that therefore, that those were like the same ages and the same time scales were occurring in different areas. So his work was very influential on Darwin down the line. Darwin was, a lot of his work when he was traveling was with fossils. He was also fascinated by fossils. Then we have a close friend of Darwin, getting into Darwin's day now, is Charles Lyell. He was a geologist. So while past geographers like Smith and I just forgot his name, Cuvier, believed in this cataclysm theory, that the world and species were shaped by cataclysmic events. Lyell's research showed that the Earth was shaped by more gradual and constant forces over time, that things just move slow, and therefore he pushed that finding pushed the age of the Earth even further because things happened at such a gradual pace. And he believed the world was just infinitely old. And yeah, he was a contemporary and close friend of Darwin, which his name, make a mental note. We'll see him pop up again later on in this story. So yeah, so now we're seeing that not just that species change, but that species go extinct, species can die out, and that the Earth is really old. So we're really setting the foundation for mainstreaming the theory of evolution here. So evolution by the 1800s, it's a biological concept. It's known, it's debated. but there's not widespread mainstream acceptance. So what was missing basically was a mechanism for evolution. So for the sake of argument, scientists of that day would be like, okay, let's say evolution is a thing. How? How could that possibly happen? Why would things change? So that was a big mystery for a while. So this brings in Lamarck. He's another naturalist and biologist, and he went kind of harking back to those early ideas of essentialism. He believed that life was created spontaneously. So back in the day, that's why Redi did his experiment. It was important science in his day. So Lamarck really did believe things were spontaneously created, and that things subsequently increase in complexity as they adapt to the environment. Excuse me. So the crux of his argument was that, or his hypothesis there was that organisms adapt through use or disuse of their bodies, and their offspring acquire these characteristics. So that's Lamarckian inheritance. So famously, he postulated that giraffes were derived from ancestors that increasingly were trying to stretch their neck to reach higher and higher branches. And then as their neck stretched, then their kids would have that length of neck. And then as they stretched it more, they'd get a longer neck, and their kids would have that length of neck. And then the next generation would stretch their neck more and more and more. So it's basically like, if you work out a lot and you're ripped, then you'll have a ripped baby. It's essentially what that theory is. It did not stand up to scrutiny, though a lot of people bought into it. So what have we learned that is at odds with Lamarck's theory? Why do we now understand that this isn't the case? So do we inherit acquired traits? That's a key word there, acquired. No, we don't. There needs to be a genetic component there. So those are just environmental alterations to your phenotype. Remember things like you could have a gene that would possibly make you tall, but if you don't get the right nutrition, then you won't live up to that. But just because you were tall, because whatever environmental factors, you had good nutrition, isn't what's influencing your kids being tall. It has to have a genetic component to it. So that was up to Darwin. The biggest explanation for how evolution occurs was its Lamarckian inheritance, which is really just you use something, it gets better, and your kids get it. You don't use it, you lose it. But again, didn't stand up to scrutiny. Right. So if he had access to Mendel's work, which at that point I believe was out, or it could have just been put out, then that would have dashed his theory right away and helped Darwin a lot. But as we learned last week, Mendel's stuff wasn't really read until the 1900s. It just kind of fell into obscurity. So yeah, there's a quick rundown of what we look at so far from the book. Buffon all the way up to Lyell and Lamarck. So we've gotten to this point now where people are starting to seriously consider evolution, understand extinction as a thing from fossil record, and recognize that the world is a lot older. But there's still not mainstream acceptance of evolution because there's no good explanation. Lamarck tried, but didn't hold up to scrutiny. There's no good explanation. And this is where we bring in Darwin and another important character that I'm going to highlight, Alfred Russel Wallace. So any questions so far? Ask in the chat, or you can speak up, whatever you're more comfortable with. I got my chat open on my phone here. Not seeing any. Okay. I find this stuff fascinating. You guys are my audience, and you're stuck with me, so I'm going to walk you through the history, because there's some serious drama we'll get into here. So I have so many typos. By the mid 1800s, many mainstream biologists were recognizing that modern species evolved from extinct forms, but it was the mechanism that was missing. There was still a mystery behind how this can happen, and that's why a lot of people were still able to deny evolution, is because how could it happen? So there's two British naturalists that are important to the story. There's Darwin and there's Wallace. Wallace is a bit younger than Darwin. So it's important to highlight here that neither of these men came up with a theory of evolution. Evolution had been thought about for essentially thousands of years at this point. Rather, they proposed the mechanism driving evolution of life, that is natural selection. So Darwin's theory wasn't evolution, it was natural selection. I hear that people say he's the father of evolution all the time. That's just not true. Not to dismiss the importance of natural selection. So Darwin, interesting dude, formerly educated in medicine, natural history, and theology. His dad wanted to be a doctor, and he could just play with bugs all day. And then his dad basically was like, go to theology school and be supposed to be a pastor or something like that. Interesting dude. He's in a lot of like progressive groups in his time. Progressive dude for the 1800s. But he didn't want to follow like his father. He was much more like his grandfather. So at the age of 22, he joined this 5-year survey expedition as a collector / just like the captain just wanted an educated friend to talk to, which was common in that day, of just have like another, what they saw peers. It was very elitist, another peer on the boat. And Darwin was happy to go along and play with bugs all over the world. So as the map shows there, he sailed from Europe down to South America, spent a lot of time there looking at fossils. Across the Pacific, of course, the Galapagos, all over to Australia, New Zealand, before then coming back via Africa coast up to Europe. So 5 years he was out and about. And during this time, he made a lot of geological, biological, paleontological observations that would inform his theory of natural selection. He came up with a lot of other ideas too. So during this time, he was sending a lot of letters back to Europe, and he became kind of famous for people publishing his letters. He was like this cool explorer guy. And he came back and he wrote a book about his voyage with the Beagle. And during that time, he came up with some other theories, not just evolution. A big one was the formation of atolls. So that's how when islands sink and they kind of have like a crown of reef, and then you're just left with a kind of a crown-shaped circular or horseshoe reef. So Darwin actually came up with that theory as well, and a bunch of other ones that I can't recall. But smart dude, very observant, took a lot of notes. That would be, if I was to say one thing that made him, a better scientist than others, is just because he was really good at taking notes and paying attention to things, not necessarily just like a really smart dude. And willing to just travel for 5 years is certainly another big thing. When we get into Wallace, so he wrote about his voyage of the Beagle, and Wallace was like a big Darwin fanboy. He loved Darwin. So during his travels, these observations informed what would become his theory of natural selection. So an example of that is the famous Darwin's finches. So he didn't really notice this until he got back to England, and he was reviewing his specimens, because of course back in the day people just shot everything and then taxidermied it. And then he got back to England, and then he started reviewing his specimens. And so he noticed that there are 13 finches that he got on Galapagos, and there's only one species of finch on the closest landmass on South America. But all 13 of the ones from the Galapagos, they all had different beak sizes and shapes, and they're associated with what I observed as their different food sources, seeds and bugs, and ground feeding versus tree foraging and that sort of thing. So his conclusion was that some ancestral South American finches dispersed, traveled over to the Galapagos, so receded the population on the Galapagos, which subsequently adapted. So let's say they got to the Galapagos and there are no birds to compete with that might have otherwise in South America been eating other food sources, parrots and things. So they had nothing to compete with. So they what we say adaptive. There's adaptive radiation, and they adapted to different niches. Another word we'll learn more about soon. Roles basically in the ecosystem, and so they diversified their beaks. And since now with newer technology and science, we've gone back and looked at this. So he was looking at their features, their physical features. We've since gone back and looked at genetics, and it really backs up this theory that they are really all descended from this South American species. So as an example, and he made many observations like this during his travels of how the species were radiating into different niches and kind of diversifying from their ancestors. So reflecting on these observations, along with past works by other scientists, including an English economist named Malthus, he put forward this theory to explain the phenomena of evolution, which is natural selection. So Malthus he did economics on human populations, and basically saying that there's not enough resources for everyone, so only some people will survive who can get to those resources. And he was really talking about economics, and that inspired Darwin to apply those economic concepts to life in general. So this is first suggested in some writings in at least 1844, but not fully presented until it's famous On the Origin of Species in 1859. So he really took his time developing this theory. So On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. It's not as catchy of a name as On the Origin of Species, but that's the full name actually of this book. So I mentioned this during, I think, the biotechnology lecture, but it was very clever of him. He first introduced the idea of natural selection using the analogy of artificial selection, which was well understood by even the laymen at the time, farmers, that sort of thing. Believed in artificial selection because they do it, that's their livelihoods, right? Raising cattle, raising crops, that sort of thing. So in artificial selection, that's selection of traits by farmers and livestock and crops that are most desirable so they can get better crop the next year and so on. So he started this book by introducing that concept to get people to be like, yeah, okay, I could see how artificial selection can act on life. And then here's a quote: "By how, it may be asked, can any analogous principle apply in nature? I believe it can and does apply most efficiently from the simple circumstance that the more diversified the descendants from any one species become in structure, constitution, and habits, by so much they will be better enabled to seize on many and widely diversified places in the polity of nature, and so be enabled to increase in numbers." So applying that to his finches, diversification of descendants, to then take advantage of diversified places. So early writings here. He went on to equate the selection of livestock crops by man to that of survival of the fittest. So owing to this struggle of life, any variation, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding, if it be in any degree profitable to an individual of any species, it is infinitely in its infinite complex relations to other organic beings and to external nature, will tend to the preservation of that individual, so the survival of that individual, and will generally be inherited by its offspring. I've called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term of natural selection. So there he is, using that term in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. So he named natural selection after artificial selection. So he's basically saying if something can better compete in that struggle for life, then it has a better chance of having offspring and surviving and having offspring. That's really essentially that's the crux of natural selection. So he did struggle with the basis of heredity, as he mentioned here, generally be inherited by its offspring. He struggled with how that happened, of course, because again, Mendel's work wasn't widely known. If only he had access to that. The laws governing inheritance are quite unknown, as he said. Fortunately, they were somewhat known at that time. He did put forth some hypotheses. At first, he talked about Lamarckism, but then he quickly threw that out. He had this idea of pangenesis, which was just this idea that we had like heritable particles in our body that happen to be most concentrated in gonads, reproductive organs, and then were passed into gametes. So it was pretty close to genes. It was just a little more ethereal, but he never found a satisfactory answer to that question. So for a while, for doubters of natural selection, that was really a point of argument. So he didn't. So I think this is an interesting fact. He did not mention evolution in the book until the very last word, actually, in the first edition specifically. I love this quote. "There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into the new forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." I think he was a good writer. Love that last line, "from so simple a beginning." So that's where he finally threw down evolution, which was a word that had been established in biological sense prior. So just hammering that in there, he came up with a theory of natural selection, not evolution. So he was very, he took a long time to publish this. He was kind of mulling over the idea for a while and did some experiments back in England. He looked at barnacles for like 8 years. And he was very nervous about publishing this because he knew of the backlash in the scientific community, but then in the wider community and the religious community of this. And he purposely avoided talking about human evolution in the book. He wrote in privately in letters that like he was like, "I'm not touching that." That's gonna be a whole thing. So his book was widely circulated. It got a lot of praise, a lot of scorn, a lot of debate. And yeah, he was purposely irreligious in his writing. He avoided talking about God directly, but in the second edition, he kind of, I guess, eased up a bit on that. And so he added to that final paragraph, having been originally breathed by the creator into new forms or into one, et cetera, et cetera. So that was added in the second edition to kind of quiet the backlash on his book, but I don't think it helped much in the long run. Yeah, so that's on the origin of species. Any questions? I'm going to talk a bit about Wallace and all the drama around the publishing of Origin of Species. The drama that was not Darwin or Wallace, but rather all the people around Darwin and Wallace. No, okay. So Alfred Russel Wallace, British naturalist, biologist, anthropologist, contemporary of Darwin, about 15, 20 years younger than Darwin. So he wasn't formally educated. He worked for years as a surveyor and engineer, and then he just decided to be a naturalist and explorer. It seems like he just read Voyage of the Beagle and some other naturalists of that day. They were kind of like superstars of that day. You know, people couldn't travel and things like that. So people wrote about their travels, and it became a big point of entertainment and things. So he just decided to be an explorer and naturalist. So he's a big Darwin fanboy, loved Darwin. So at age 31, he traveled throughout the Malay archipelago, so Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and collected specimens and studied natural history in the tropics. Forget how long he was in the tropics, quite a long time. And wrote, similar to Darwin, wrote about his travels. Wallace wrote about his travels too. And he made a lot of biological observations that would inform his theory of natural selection. And we now call that region, biologists do at least, Wallacea. And you can see it on the map. And there's the Wallace line, that blue line, which is where if you cross that line, the biodiversity completely changes from one side to the other. So that's where you cross that line, you start getting to like marsupials and different mammals, and the bird diversity changes. It's very interesting. And that has to do with like animals' ability to cross an expansive ocean there. Super interesting. We'll talk more about biogeography later, but yeah, Wallace came up with a lot of original ideas on his own as well. So collecting specimens, a lot of observations that led to the conclusion that life changes over periods of time, so evolution. But he was unsure about the mechanism that drove this evolution. He was particularly fascinated by birds of paradise and their diversity. So these are really cool birds. There's a really cool documentary on Netflix about birds of paradise that I recommend checking out. They're really pretty birds. So he talked about sexual selection, which is actually another form of natural selection. We know it now, but he didn't. Well, I won't get into that right now. So he wasn't sure what the mechanism was. So in 1958, this is the story that he was really sick I don't know if it was malaria or what, but he was really sick. And he was just super feverish, and he had hallucinations and fever dreams, and it led him, and then he fever broke. And then from all of his hallucinations and he was tripping in the jungle, he realized that species evolved through adaptation to their environment, so natural selection, which is a lot. It's a fun story. He's a very interesting dude. Darwin was very like reserved. He was very, British and sort of like stuck up a bit, but Wallace was a bit of a radical. He wasn't formally educated, and interesting dude. Go on a wiki dive about Wallace. So Wallace came to the same conclusion as Darwin, that is evolution by natural selection. So Wallace, big fan of Darwin. Even before this point, he had written to Darwin. They had been in correspondence. And as I said, he was inspired to be a naturalist in part by Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. So he mailed this paper that he wrote about natural selection on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. He sent that to Darwin and asked him to share it with Lyell, the geography, as we learned about earlier. Lyell, a close friend of Darwin, he had been bugging Darwin for years, like, you need to publish your work because someone's going to swoop in and think of it before you. And this did come to pass with Wallace. So Darwin thought of it, as I said before, as early as 1844. And he was just at home writing about just getting more evidence of natural selection, doing experiments, studying English barnacles and things like that. Quote from Wallace's on the tendency of varieties right there. I won't read through all of that, but interesting quote. It's very similar to what Darwin was saying. So Darwin, he was building the case on the theory. Again, as I said, he was very reserved and he was really worried about the backlash. So he wanted to be sure that he wasn't going to be another Lamarck. So as I said, 8 years just studying barnacles and variation in barnacles. He also got sick a lot, and his kids got sick a lot because he married his cousin, which is never a good idea. A lot of deleterious traits. And he recognized that too. He was like, in his writings, he was like, dang it, I shouldn't have married my cousin, but I love her so much. And his son died right around when all this was going down, and Wallace sent him that paper. So he was dealing with the death of his son. Lyell and then Joseph Hooker, British botanist, they brought together Darwin and Wallace's writings, so Darwin's letters and correspondence and some early drafts of articles, and then Wallace's writings on natural selection, submitted it to the Linnaean Society of London, which is the big naturalist group in London, which I think is still a thing now, so he combined them into a big paper, Lyell and Hooker, and it was read to the group's members. So neither Wallace or Darwin attended this reading. Wallace didn't even know what was going on because mail takes so long back then. He was clueless. He just assumed Darwin and Lyell, were having their minds blown. Sorry, dog barking. Wallace was still in Borneo. Darwin was attending his son's funeral, and then his son died of scarlet fever. So then his funeral, and then, as we're quite familiar with now, he had to go into quarantine. So he didn't know all this was going down either, the reading and such. So a lot of drama. So the next year, Darwin rushed with Lyell and Hooker assisting as editors to collect his observations and to get a book out there. So he wrote On the Origin of Species in like a year, which is crazy because it's like one of the most influential books ever written. And so it was published, and we learned about that on the previous slides. So Wallace would go on to publish works on biology and geology, and again, as I mentioned, talk about sexual selection and biography, which are cool topics we'll learn about soon. And he wrote a lot in support of Darwin. Like they were on friendly terms like all their lives. So you see all these things about drama. I play here. It's like a YouTube video. Darwin's frenemy at Wallace, and it's so silly. It's like Wallace was like a huge Darwin fanboy, and Darwin almost like he would have just been like giving it to Wallace the fame, but Lyell and Hooker were like, dude, what are you doing? So it's all even today, it's drama around those two, but they were cool with each other. And then Wallace would go on to write about, he's super progressive in his day. He was an abolitionist, and he talked about global warming and climate change, industrialization, and all this stuff back in the day. He was one of the first anti-vaxxers, though. I will knock him for that. But in defense of him, they were literally just invented. So if there's ever a time to be a valid anti-vaxxer, I guess it was then. Yeah, read about these two. They're kind of weirdos, kind of interesting humans. So yeah, so big takeaway there. I just like talking about this history, but the main takeaway there, that Darwin came up with a mechanism for evolution, which was natural selection. So any questions about that history? I can go on and on, especially about Wallace. Wallace is super fascinating. Nothing? Okay, don't worry, I won't put any of these on the final about the history of these two. Okay, so all that exposition out of the way. I'll just finish off next 5 minutes. Evolution is descent with modification. So within a population, individuals in each generation differ slightly from other members of preceding and subsequent generations. Evolution is a change over time in the characteristics of the population. So as certain traits are more selected, they become more prevalent in the population. Excuse me. So yeah, natural selection, mechanism of evolution. Individuals undergo selection, that is Darwin's survival of the fittest. Variations among individual traits affect their fitness. So the fitness is basically your ability to survive. So bringing back this quote that I keep hammering in throughout this class, the deleterious or advantageous nature of a mutation is dependent on whether that genotypic change affects the fitness, there's that word now, of the organism's phenotype. So how do we get new traits in a population? Mutations, and then, or rather, in individuals, and in a population by selection, natural selection of those traits to then become, the majority of the population, assuming they're advantageous. So more advantageous traits survive and reproduce, assuming they're inheritable. And those traits will be more prevalent in the next generation, and so on and so forth. So it's based on 4 postulates. So postulate 1, individual members of a population differ from one another in many respects. So that's variation, that's diversity. And do we differ? Do other animals, plants? Yeah, I mean, we see diversity in humans, of course. Those are all the same species of snail there, same species of flower. So example, in flowers, I think the book mentions this, that some flowers are preferred by pollinators. They basically see the color better, and then down the line, those are going to pollinate more of that color of flower. And so over time, those will be selected, they'll reproduce more, and so we'll have more and more of that color of flower, and so on. So natural selection needs diversity to work upon. Postulate 2, at least some of the differences among members of the population are due to characteristics that may be passed from one parent to the offspring. So these are heritable traits. So it's not just about having diversity, but having heritable diversity. And Darwin couldn't explain that. But now we understand, as we learned in the last few weeks, we have our DNA, we have our genes, we have our alleles, and so we now have this mechanism for inheritance for postulate 2. So the diversity has to come from our genes. Postulate 3, in each generation, some individuals in a population survive and reproduce successfully, others do not. So this is the survival of the fittest. This is the varying degrees of fitness in a population. So that diversity, there has to be variation in that diversity. If there's no higher or lower fitness in the diversity, then there's going to be just neutral selection. Nothing's going to be favored. But if one is more favored than the other, then it'll tend towards selection of the favored trait. So variation in survival, not all reaching sexual maturity, and variation in reproduction, not all reproducing. So it all comes down to reproduction, right? It doesn't matter how fit you are in the biological evolutionary sense. If you can't have kids, then you have 0 fitness. It's not going to influence the population in subsequent generations. So here's an example here we'll talk about later. Variations in the color of these moths moths and how they're trying to camouflage. You can see how one might be selected over the other in either circumstance, and we'll expand on this in a couple slides. And postulate 4, an individual's likelihood of survival and reproduction depends on its traits, not just chance. Individuals with advantageous traits survive longer, leave more offspring, et cetera, et cetera. So this is finally natural selection. And this GIF shows survival. If you can camouflage, then you'll probably survive better in that case. Natural selection in action. So your 4 postulates: individuals in a population vary, traits are passed down, individuals either fail to or succeed in surviving and reproducing, and this survival isn't by chance, but by those very traits, favored traits. So scaling this up to the population level, it's occurring across all individuals in the population. We can begin to see how evolution can happen. Which we'll talk more about those moths, but might call it a day here because it's starting to get dark. Are there any questions though going forward beyond these postulates?
Can you hear me? Oh,
yes.
Okay. I just have a question regarding the worksheet.
Sure.
Yeah, because there's directional, stabilizing, or disruptive selection. So I'm kind of confused on what each mean. I'm trying to read the website that goes along with it, but I'm still not getting the meaning of it.
Right. Let me bring up the worksheet real quick.
I'm stuck with the ones going down to 6 to 10 because I'm not sure how to answer it.
6
I know
to 10. Okay.
It says to put down the types of selections, but I'm not sure what's the meaning behind each one of those.
So you have directional selection. So talking about Darwinian selection there, the natural selection. We had that example with the GIF with the chameleon eating the beetles. So directional selection, that's an example of directional selection. So you have a population with some traits, in this case, color variation. And so on that graph, you would see that nice curve. That would be the variance in your colors, we'll say, of beetles. And then if they're all getting selected to be more favorably green, then you have directional selection in the direction of greener beetles. That variation was from brown to green, right? That graph would shift to the green side. So that would be your directional selection. And so if you had disruptive, so that would be like, let's say you could have a very brown beetle or a very green beetle. You can have beetles on bark, you could have beetles on the leaves, but if you're in the middle, you're not really that green or that brown, then you're going to stand out on both surfaces. In that case, the chameleon would be able to eat that intermediary beetle. And so you have selection to be either very brown or very green. So you'd have that diversifying selection. And then stabilizing selection is just the opposite of that. Let's say for whatever reason that intermediary was the highest fitness. Then that spread, a variation in colors would be stabilized towards that middle to be the most intermediary color. So that's why you have those nice curve graphs, so they either like shift from one side to the other, or split apart into one or the other kind of variation on that trait, or tighten up as just the most intermediary of those traits. So that's what those curves are demonstrating, is variance in some given trait, whether that be color or height or weight, etc. Does that help clear things up at all?
Yeah, I think it makes sense now.
Okay. So let me know. If you have any other questions, you can shoot me a message on Moodle.
All right.
All right. Any other questions?
That's good for me. I'm good.
Okay. Cool. Not seeing anything else. Yeah. Okay, so that's an old message, but yeah, so this is recorded. I'll get this up as soon as I can. I'll get that quiz up. I'll give you an extra day. Like I said, I'll make it do with, whatever, 11:59 on Sunday. And again, lab due in 2 weeks. Please, both groups A and B submit it on this week's Moodle page. That's the Annual lab. Okay, we're gonna talk more about evolution next week. You can't tell I like the topic of evolution. Okay, great. I guess we're good. Stay safe, everyone. Wear your mask. Bye. Have a good night.
All right. See ya.
Yeah.